Welcome back to the BODcast with Ali and Chris. I'm Ali Covington, and this is...
And I'm Chris.
Okay, the single word, single name
Chris.
guy. Yeah, okay,
it's
fine.
just like Jack. I mean,
you know
it's
what?
Jack,
I'm just
right?
going to start calling you just Chris.
Just Chris. There we go.
That way we have two names. So just
like,
and then Chris.
Is that my pronouns now? Just / Chris?
Yes, those are your pronouns. So I'm super excited for this one. We've been waiting for it for a little while. It's been a long time coming when I scheduled this guest today. And the reason why I'm so excited is because he is a really prominent researcher and microbiologist. And I was introduced to him about 5 years ago, right after I did a TV interview that I was explaining how his probiotic helps with fat loss. And I was talking about Bride Bod because we were Bride Bod back then. We weren't Bod Company yet. And it was a really great TV interview. Got a lot of views on Facebook, over 17,000. So it pops up in my memories today. And I went, of course.
What timing?
Of course, today is the day when that comes back up. So if you want to go see that, check out that cool TV interview. It's on YouTube. They linked it to YouTube, but for some reason on Facebook, it showed 17,000 views, but that didn't translate over to the YouTube views, which I don't understand why, if they were just using the link on Facebook, but regardless. So what it was for a company called Silver Fern Brand. Now, this particular guest that we're having today, he built their probiotic with 3 of the 5 strains that he uses in his company. And so he is the chief science officer of Microbiome Labs, but he's also the general manager of Novazymes. That's who bought them for a little over 100 million, I believe.
Yeah, it was quite the big acquisition. It was very,
yeah, I know, because you looked that up. But and so that's not a small thing, but he's also got like dozens of patents and about 20 different clinical trials that he's on. And the reason why I like them, and as you know, my beef with the supplement industry for decades since I've been in the industry is that because it's unregulated, people can say whatever they want. They can make whatever claims they want about their products. So I have by and large for my entire fitness career told people I have not recommended supplements at all. I have not recommended a single one to anybody up until this probiotic. And the only reason I did is because they furnished me with white papers on how their probiotic helps people become more insulin sensitive so that therefore diabetics can start to step down off their medication. Those are white papers. Those are independent clinical trials that are verifying their information and their claims. The other thing is that it's a DNA verified, their products are DNA verified. So what they're telling you is in the bottle is actually in the bottle. And it's shelf stable. So that means that it actually gets past your stomach acid and into your gut where it needs to go, which is why eating a bunch of yogurt isn't sufficient to help your gut microbiome. And that's why when people say, well, just eat prebiotic foods, I'm like, a lot of that's going to get destroyed. It's going to take a really long time to get the results that you're looking for when you're just trying to get it through foods and not a very specifically created type of probiotic and prebiotic. So I'm excited to have him on. I'm excited to have him on. A few weeks ago, I was in a master class with a bunch of other practitioners with him and on the gut-brain axis. And as you know, I have been really diving into this since January of 2019 when I started to see my third child, my little guy, when I started to see his development start to slow down instead of speed up. And it was right after he got his first set of shots. And I thought, what is going on? And I wanted to really understand it. And so we're going to ask him questions about that. I've got questions about vaccines. I've got questions about gut skin axis and autism and everything. So I am super excited, but he dropped some little nuggets in that class that made me go, what? I had no idea I had no
how much
idea
of an impact that it has. Yeah.
that we have on each other.
Right. Yeah, we talked a little bit about that in one of those in the podcast just after that, about how we just like dropped a little bit of that. Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
very, very interesting how like even the people you live with have an impact on your gut biome.
Who knew? Which as a parent makes me think, okay, this is the most important thing that I can do for my kids, but also not rushing out to get antibiotics whenever there's a sniffle is also vitally important. So I'm super excited he's going to join us today. In fact, I think I'm so excited I don't even want to talk about us, but we will until he gets here. So but since I've given him that little introduction, we don't have to do it in front of him when he gets here. And
we get to dive right in for the time we let him.
Yeah. So in the meantime, we've had some pretty interesting couple of weeks here at Bod Company.
We definitely have. I think probably the most interesting that's been happening, it's in the progress of happening, is we've started talking with a local gym owner where I'm living at about getting our new premium packages, these kind of VIP packages, where we're trying to really give that whole, full holistic approach to bringing somebody in, coaching them, getting their nutrition dialed in, their gut biome dialed in. And so we've been talking to them and we've been getting some really great feedback, some excitement on their part. It's very new for them because they're just like, well, we just lift weights with people and help them, help their form. It's like, well, how about we take that to the next level and start dialing in nutrition and all of that? Because they see it every day. They see people come in who are like, they're 200 pounds overweight and they're saying, oh, my diet's fine. It's like, really? I think there's a little denial there. And it's the tricky thing it's a difficult conversation to have. But it's also something that it's going to be a very interesting problem for us to come in and hopefully provide a good solution to that they can you bring to their clients.
That was a very fun few days. Yeah. Having that conversation with one of the trainers, having the conversation with the gym owner. And he was so excited. He was like, I can introduce you to the owner of Anytime Fitness. And I went, let's just
one step
at a time. Let's just pilot you, get some numbers, get some data.
Right.
And that makes the difference.
And build up. And because we've got some learning curve to do too. We're going to figure out, we know what works for us. We're finding what works for bringing our clients in. It might be very different for a gym owner. There might be differences in how they approach. There might be differences in the kinds of packages that they provide. So this is all going to be learning process.
And we're going to figure it out. Yeah, but creating a template by which we can go and speak to other franchise owners, because Crunch Fitness is also franchise owned. They have a corporate, but each gym is independently owned and you can own as many of them as you want. So I already know one of those gym owners, and it would be really nice to just be able to hand him a template. Here you go. Here's the data.
Right. And here's the package. Here's kind of a, nutrition profile program. Give them a bit of a template on here's
what we know works so far.
Right. Here's what we know. Here's how to onboard people. Here's how to get people signed up. Here's how to get people into the system. And, there's lots to figure out with all the tracking, billing, all that fun stuff. But it's gonna be really cool.
Yeah.
Well, something that we talked about a while ago about bringing in trainers that aren't ours, or we're not hiring, but kind of affiliating with or bringing in under kind of an affiliate style umbrella almost.
Yeah. Well, and you've got some work to do in creating an interface that,
Yeah, this isn't something that we've touched too much. We've started to just a little bit, but it'll be, the more of these we get, the more priority that's going to have. And that'll be a really big thing because we do want to be able to scale like that.
And what's really exciting for me is that part of that VIP package is this gut microbiome restoration and optimization.
Right.
And so I'm super thrilled that Kiran's going to get on here with us. And I'm just like so excited. I want to go check my text messages, make sure he's hopping on.
Right.
Like, hi, we're ready for you. But it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a great time. So what else is new?
A big update to the app just recently. We had we've been wanting to make it easier and easier to use, and people logging food. So we've made it easier to kind of go through that and take a meal from the past and just log the whole thing in. And there's Kiran.
Hey there, sir. Good to see your face.
Good to see you as well. It's been a long time.
5 years.
Is it 5 years?
5 years. You know how I know that? Because Facebook let me know that 5 years ago today we launched and posted that TV interview that I did where I was showcasing Silver Fern,
Right.
And then I met you afterward.
Right. Yeah, like a couple months after that. Yeah.
And we did a Facebook Live together at the hotel there in Newport Beach. So lots has happened. We've already introed you.
Oh, okay, good.
So the world knows who you are. And we were just kind of, giving quick little updates on BOD Company before you hopped on. But I've got a ton of great questions and things I really want you to touch on. Okay. It started with that masterclass that you did a few weeks ago on the gut-brain axis.
Okay, awesome.
And you touched on a couple of things that you said it in passing. And I went, wait, hold on. I need to know more about that.
Yeah.
One of the things you said was that the people that we live with, our microbiomes get affected by each other. So if we could start there and start diving in, I would love it.
Sure. Yeah.
How's that work?
That works fantastic. Yeah, I'm happy to take this conversation anywhere you'd like. So
you're wonderful. Thank you.
We get you guys the information that you need. So yeah, speaking about that, I kind of refer to it as like our microbiome cloud, right? That exists within little micro environments that we exist and spend a lot of time in, like our homes or even in our offices. These areas where we tend to congregate a lot with similar people will have this influential cloud around us. So the study that really definitively showed this was a study that was published I believe in 2019, and I think it was done out of Johns Hopkins University. And what they were able to show was that they were following individuals that were given a prescription of antibiotics at the hospital. And prior to starting the antibiotic prescription, they took a number of stool samples, and they, of course, mapped out their microbiome. And then during the course of the antibiotics, and then after 6 months after stopping the antibiotics, they continue to take samples and map out the microbiome. So not surprisingly, they found out that from that individual's baseline, during the course of the antibiotics, they saw a measurable disruption to the microbiome. And then they could see that same measurable disruption present even up to 6 months after the course of the antibiotics, right? And that part wasn't so surprising because other studies have shown that. There was a clindamycin study that showed that a single 7-day course, you could map the disruption to the microbiome up to 2 years after stopping the antibiotic. Wow. So it plays a profound role in creating disturbances. But what this study did that was special was also follow the microbiomes of people within the same household as those individuals, but they were not taking the antibiotic. And what they found was similar disruptions in those people, not only during the course of the antibiotics, but also up to 6 months after that one individual finished the antibiotic, right?
To the same magnitude?
Not to the same magnitude, but very similar disruption. Wow. So same type of disruption, but not necessarily as severe, which is really fascinating, right? So when you think about it, and it didn't have to be intimate partners. It could be siblings, it could be platonic partners, roommates. So it didn't have to do with intimacy, as we would think that's how you share microbes the most. But at the end of the day, what that tells us is that in our little micro communities, we really do share microbes even more than we probably think, right? And when one person's gut is severely disrupted and they're putting those new microbes out, the new proliferating pathogenic organisms or opportunistic organisms, that has an influence on the microbiome of the rest of the individuals. The first thought that people had was, is there somehow an exposure to the antibiotic by the other people, right? And that's less likely because antibiotics work at really, really minuscule doses. That's part of their definition. And most of those antibiotics clear the gut within about 2.5, 3 hours. And then the half-life in the body tends to be about 8 to 12 hours. And hence most of those are dosed BID, right? So twice a day. So the likelihood that there's enough antibiotic coming out of this person somehow and then spreading to everybody else is really, really minuscule. More than likely what it is you're now sharing higher levels of overgrown or opportunistic organisms that the other inhabitants in the household are picking up. So let's talk about how you do that. Right?
I was going to say, what's the mechanism by which that happens?
Yeah, so the mechanisms are not that sexy, to tell you. They're kind of gross in many ways. So let's say you're taking the antibiotic, Allie, and you go to the toilet, you defecate in the toilet, right? So now you've got all of this wonderful poop in the toilet, and then you flush it, right? And then that creates a vortex. That vortex actually creates an aerosolization of lots of the microbes on your stool sample out into the air. And then, of course, that gets pulled in through the intakes in your air conditioning and goes through and gets sucked back out through the home. So you've got kind of poop dust flying around all over the house all day long, right?
Now I think I'm going to teach my kids to at least put the lid down before they flush. Right? I think this becomes important.
Totally. Even things like, if you look at, dust around the house, right? You don't dust for a day or two, you see this film of dust everywhere. That what you physically see as dust is all 90% human skin cells, right? And that's the largest component of dust. And for every one human skin cell, there's about 35 microbial cells. So you're shedding lots of bacteria through your skin into the environment as well.
There's really nothing you can do about it.
Nothing you can do about it.
You can't wear a mask. You can't sanitize it away. Okay.
And here's the thing: if your gut is not dysbiotic and you're not taking an antibiotic actively at the moment, that actually is a good thing. This kind of interaction, this exchange is designed to happen because that's kind of how we diversify our microbial pool, right? So other studies have shown that households with more individuals in it tend to have overall healthier individuals. Households with dogs tend to have people with healthier individuals, with kids with lower incidence of asthma, allergies, and so on, because of the diversity of microbes. Yeah, exactly. So the whole idea here is that we do exchange microbes. However, we have to be careful that if there is an individual that's going through a significant dysbiosis, they can influence the rest of the of people within the household. So if and the important message there is that if you're working with a client, for example, and your client is struggling with anxiety, right? The client is likely dealing with severe dysbiosis because most of anxiety and stress management issues and sleep disorders start in the gut, right? The whole gut-brain axis. Which
I want you to get into that a little bit more too when you finish your sentence.
Yeah, we can totally dive into that. So that client is struggling with severe dysbiosis. Now, if you're just dealing with that client and making recommendations and trying to help and coach that client along, if that client lives within a household where somebody else has a microbiome that's toxic enough that has a negative influence on that on your client, then everything that you're doing with that one person is really taking kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? So it becomes important to think of the whole household when it comes to these kind of health and wellness issues. Yeah. So a lot of the doctors we work with, what I encourage them to do is if you have a patient, which is a child or one of the adults that's suffering from anxiety, depression, and so on, you really have to take approaches to dealing with the gut microbiome of everyone in the household, right? Or one or two people could continuously influence the main person's issue in a negative way.
So you also talked about autism and things like that. Now I know that I know parents with children with autism, and there's a lot of people that are doing like fecal transplants. And I'm thinking, after what you just said, why would you do that for one person when you're not addressing the needs of the rest of the household? Because how effective is that going to be?
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's I've gotten to speak at a number of autism conferences in the last few years, and my main message at the end of the day to the parents that are there at the conference is that you see the complete devotion and dedication that these parents have, right, to understanding every aspect of everything that impacts their child. Every food that goes into them, every drink, everything that goes on them, everything that's around them, and they spend so much of their time and effort with that while they're really not taking care of themselves, right? So they let themselves go, and that's understandable. You know, you're completely dedicated and devoted to trying to maximize this child's potential and upbringing. But if you let yourself go and you're becoming dysbiotic, you're becoming, you know, anxious and depressed and so on, your gut is becoming leaky, then you can have a negative influence on your own child, right? Even though you're there taking care of your child. So my message to them is it's equally important for you to take care of you as you're doing that, as you're being a parent, because part of your child's therapeutics is you should be healthy. If you're not, you're going to set them back.
Right. And it's going to make it harder to get them as well as possible too.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible I've heard one story of one child ever whose mom put him on a non-GMO, gluten-free, dairy-free, like super strict diet, and his diagnosis got reversed.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't heard a ton of stories like that. But then again, I'm also not diving into that section of the world too much either. Have you heard of that kind of thing happening on more and more occasions, or significant increase benefit to like the behaviors and the symptoms of those types of disorders?
Yeah, so I think if you make dramatic changes to the diet, I think you'll see measurable change, but it won't necessarily reverse the condition, right? And part of the reason for that is there's such severe dysbiosis going on in those kids, and in large part there's a very high pathogen load of a specific type of pathogens. There's Clostridium tetani or Clostridium bolte. These are some of the well-known Clostridia, and then there's other pathogens as well associated with autism spectrum disorders that tend to be high and elevated in these individuals. And of course, the dietary changes and all that can help some of that metabolic process, reduce some of the inflammation and all that, but ultimately you may have to be more aggressive about going after a change in the microbiome. You know,
Gotcha.
I'll give an example of this, right? So, and this is not a sustainable treatment, but there was a study done where they took kids who were first diagnosed with spectrum disorders, and they put them on I think it's like a 2-month antibiotic course, right? A vancomycin course. As it turned out, that course of vancomycin completely reversed their symptomology, right? So. Which indicates, now, of course, that's not sustainable because you can't be on antibiotics forever. If you are, you're going to cause all kinds of other problems. But what that illustrated was that if you intervene in the microbiome in an aggressive manner, that can have a very profound effect, right? And so that's really the message to me is like, okay, yes, you have to clean up things like lifestyle, diet. You know, you should go non-GMOs. You should try to reduce exposure to Roundup and glyphosate. You should, reduce exposure to gluten and things that cause inflammation in your child. But you do have to do something aggressive about shifting the microbiome.
Okay, so that leads me to another question. What about things like epilepsy?
Yeah, so epilepsy is also associated with gut-brain inflammation. Epilepsy can be tied back to leaky gut and something called LPS endotoxemia. I think if you heard me talk, I talk a lot about LPS endotoxemia, right? Lipopolysaccharide.
Can you explain just a little bit more for everybody what that is?
Yeah, so in your gut, and every bacteria in the world actually can be divided into one of two categories, gram-negative or gram-positive, right? And what that means is that there's a particular type of stain called a gram stain. So when you take a bacteria, you look at it under a microscope and you add the stain to the bacteria, if it picks up the stain, it means it's gram-positive. If it doesn't pick up the stain, it means it's gram-negative. So it picks up the stain if it has a cell wall structure around it, right? And so the cell wall is what's picking up the stain. So those bacteria are called gram-positive. Gram-negative bacteria do not have a cell wall; they have a cell membrane. which is
Gotcha.
a much looser kind of membrane, so they don't pick up the stain. So now
Okay.
gram-negative bacteria, on the other hand, do have something called lipopolysaccharide within that cell membrane of theirs,
Okay.
right? So this is a transmembrane component. It sticks out like this through the membrane. Part of it is inside the bacterial cell, part of it is outside, and then the bacteria use it to sense things. It uses it for adhesion. It uses it to signal to other bacteria. It's like a little antenna receptor thing on the bacteria. When it's in the bacteria, it's perfectly fine. And also, there's a lot of gram-negative pathogens in the system, right? So a lot of the more egregious pathogens are gram-negative bacteria. So what has happened over time is our immune system has learned to recognize gram-negative bacteria by the presence of this LPS thing that sticks out from it, right?
Okay.
So if your immune system sees LPS, it goes, oh shit, there may be a pathogen around, so it gears up and it gets ready, right? And it takes the presence of LPS very seriously. And so what tends to happen in the gut, about 60% of the microbes in your gut are gram-negative bacteria, right? So about a little more than half are gram-negative, and so they're constantly reproducing and all that. They're not really causing any harm. They all have this LPS sticking out of their membrane. What happens is when the bacteria die for some reason, like during the process of digestion. So during the process of digestion, lots of bacteria end up dying, right? It's just a violent process. There's lots of acids and bile salts and enzymes and churning and all that. So bacteria start to erupt and die. And when they die, they break open, and this little LPS is left all by itself, right? So now the LPS is floating around in the lumen of the gut. That's the tube part of the gut lining. If your gut is leaky, what happens is that LPS leaks through the lining of your gut and ends up into your circulation.
Right.
And when it's in your circulation, it acts as a very potent toxin. Because remember, your immune system is highly geared towards identifying and dealing with LPS, right?
And it wants to attack it.
Say that again.
And it wants to attack it. And then
it wants to attack it, yeah. In fact, it's so important that your immune system makes a protein called LBP, called Lps Binding Protein. And the whole purpose of this protein is to float around your body all the time looking for LPS, right? In case something happens. And so when your immune system encounters the LBP grabs it and then takes the LPS and takes it to immune cells, your macrophages, your dendritic cells, and then alerts them and goes, hey guys, we've got an invasion of bacteria coming in. And then their macrophage and dendritic cells freak out and they launch this massive inflammatory response, right? And that inflammatory response that you get from LPS being in your circulation is the same as you get from sepsis or bacterial poisoning, right?
Whoa.
Because that's what your body is anticipating. So imagine if your gut is leaky, after you eat a meal, you get a 7-fold increase in the amount of LPS in circulation, right?
Wow.
At 7x increase. That means you're getting bacterial sepsis response all throughout your body, occurring in your brain when LPS makes its way up the vagus nerve into your brain, into your heart, into your joints, into your skin, virtually everywhere in your body that LPS can make it into, and it makes it into every part of your system. Every part of that system is getting a massive inflammatory response because your body thinks you're being invaded by billions of gram-negative bacteria.
So this isn't just mood disorders or gut bloating. This is psoriasis, eczema, heart disease.
Yep, heart disease. It's the number one driver of heart disease. So the biggest marker for heart disease issues, heart risk of heart disease is something called interleukin-1 beta. And interleukin-1 beta is a cytokine that's expressed by lots of cells in the lining of the vessels, right?
Okay.
And the biggest trigger for interleukin-1 beta release is the presence of LPS. And then it's also the number one predictor of development of type 2 diabetes, right? There was a study called the Cordioprev study that took like 460 patients over 60 months. These were all pre-diabetic patients, right? And they followed them over 60 months, measuring dozens of different markers to figure out what marker was most predictive of the development of type 2 diabetes from being pre-diabetic. And there was only one marker, and that was the amount of LPS in your circulation, right? And then the American Diabetic Association has published numerous studies showing that LPS in circulation is the root cause, what they call the primary insult, that starts the inflammatory response that leads to insulin sensitivity and development of type 2 diabetes. LPS in circulation is the number one driver of obesity too. It actually, when LPS interacts with your adipose tissue, in your midsection and everywhere else, it actually swells your fat cells to almost twice the normal volume, right? So it's taking your adipocytes and swelling it up.
So it's making you even look fatter than you really are.
Exactly. It's making you look bloated, or more bloated, more heavier. And it also increases the volume of the adipocytes so they can hold more fat.
Oh, that's charming.
Yeah, it drives that, right?
That's what everybody wants.
And it doesn't end there, right? So LPS is also the number one driver of development of Alzheimer's. So gut-derived LPS enriched in perinuclear regions of the brain, is the number one driver of the beta plaquing that starts the Alzheimer's process. LPS is the number one driver of Parkinson's disease, which starts in the vagus nerve, and then the inflammation and damage to the vagus nerve eventually ends up damaging the central nervous system as well. LPS is the number one driver of low testosterone in men.
Really?
The whole issue of hypogonadism. What tends to happen is as your LPS levels keep increasing as you get older, and it doesn't, you don't have to be old. You can be in your 20s, right? And if your LPS levels are high, your body thinks you're sick, right? Because it thinks you're infected and it thinks you're sick. So it's a counteracting, because when your LPS is high and you're sick, you don't produce testosterone, because the last thing biology wants you to do is have boners and running around and procreating when you're sick, right? And so,
it's shifting your nervous system in that other direction towards dealing with all of
Oh, that was great.
Right.
Okay.
So we're not going to party and rest. Right. Stay in the cave and rest. You're sick. And so there's not a thing that it doesn't affect. We just finished our second acne study that we did, and there's all of this data that shows that if you have risk for acne, genetic risk and other biological risk factors, if you have elevated levels of LPS, you're going to show acne lesions. If you don't have elevated levels of LPS, you may not show any acne lesions at all, despite the risk, right? Other things that LPS is impacting: cancer outcomes.
I can imagine that. Yeah.
Right. So cachexia is the wasting syndrome in cancer, where people start dramatically losing weight and all that. It used to be assumed that that was driven because of the changes in diet and the chemotherapy, but now there's much more definitive studies, large-scale studies, that show that it has nothing to do with the change in diet or chemotherapy. It has everything to do with leakiness in the gut and how much LPS you have in circulation. If you have high levels of LPS in circulation, your risk for developing cachexia is much higher. And cachexia accounts for about 60% of the mortality in cancer. So it's endless. I mean, LPS also is the biggest driver of serotonin and dopamine dysfunction in the brain, because it sits in the serotonin receptors and prevents it from binding serotonin. Wow. I mean, it's one of the most egregious things that people really don't address enough. And at the end of the day, the whole goal is keep it from leaking through. Right.
Okay.
It's going to be produced in the gut all the time. You can't get away from it. That's why it's called an endotoxin, because it's a toxin that's derived from the internally. Right. Yeah. Versus an exotoxin, which is something that comes from your environment, like a mold toxin, for example. And so this endotoxin is not something you can get away from. You have to stop it from migrating past the gut lining.
Chris, there's dogs barking.
That's not mine.
That's not you. Oh, is that you, Kiran?
That's mine.
Okay.
They're going nuts.
Okay.
The kids are coming home or something.
I'm like, there's no dog here.
So I have a question. So if what we're after is to not take antibiotics and not affect everybody else, but we have this leaky gut, and I definitely want you to talk about what do we do about leaky gut? How does diet impact that? But my question is, if we're trying to get away from getting sick, how do vaccines help or hurt our gut microbiome?
Yeah. So, I would say that we don't necessarily need to be concerned about getting sick, right? yes, you're going to need antibiotics at some point. And at some point, it's perfectly important for you to take them. And the good news is you can recover from them, right? So if you know what you're doing, if you have the right tools at hand, you can absolutely recover from the impact that antibiotics have. You can absolutely prevent the antibiotic from actually affecting your microbiome at all, even during the course of the antibiotics, right? So
I definitely want to know about that too.
Yeah, so that's some of the studies that we've done, and we published a study on this in 2020, showing that you can actually completely reverse or even prevent any changes that the antibiotics may make in the gut microbiome if you use the right tools. So and getting sick is okay. It's about being able to recover from it, not progressing into this crazy cytokine storm and all that. But vaccines are good in a way because they prime the immune system to meet what you're supposed to be encountering outside, right? So that's the whole idea behind it. There isn't any impact so far that we've seen from research on how vaccines impact the microbiome specifically. And I would imagine that that's all centered around what your microbiome looks like at the time of the vaccine, right? So there are, of course, people that react negatively to vaccines, right? No doubt about that. And I think that's something that should be acknowledged and well documented and all that. But these are also individuals that react negatively to lots of other things, right? Actual illness, for example. So if you get injected with a vaccine and you have a really egregious reaction, you've got lots of inflammation, you're sick, your body's going through the spiraling of inflammatory damage, your microbiome is likely already off, and the immunological system that's designed to identify the antigen that's in the vaccine and mount an appropriate response is really not functioning the way it should be, right? So then your immune system kind of takes this tangent in the wrong direction. Too much of that innate immune response and inflammatory damage that occurs versus moving towards the adaptive, where you develop all these beautiful antibodies, right? Which is what gives you the protection at the end of the day. So
that's good.
So I don't think the vaccines by themselves will have any specific damage to the microbiome. I think if your microbiome is damaged already,
that's what to address.
It can contribute to an issue.
Exactly, it can contribute to an issue. Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway that I'm getting from it so far is just like there's like an all-cause mortality just kind of jumps up a lot with the presence of this LPS and those negative bacteria.
Yeah, so there's a paper that was published in 2015. I'm sure there'll be an updated version of it coming out. It was published in the Frontiers of Immunology, and it's a meta-analysis paper, which means that it's a study of lots of different studies, right? What they concluded was that LPS endotoxemia, that is the leaking through of LPS from the lining of the gut into circulation, driven by intestinal permeability, was the #1 driver of mortality and morbidity worldwide, right? Because they can trace back from a pathology standpoint the vast majority of chronic illnesses back to this initial root cause of just having too much LPS leaking in. And it can be quite simple at the end of the day. And if we can reduce that one critical root driver, then all the other things that we do, the exercise, the dieting, the good lifestyle mechanisms, the herbs and the vitamins and all that we take will all actually be even more effective, right? Because you don't have that continuous LPS inflammation fire hose turned on in your system.
Okay, well, this is a really good time for you to tell us. Sorry, Chris, you had a question?
Well, the question that kind of extended to that for me was, what do you think is the biggest root cause of all of this excess LPS in somebody's system? Like, what drives a lot of that excess LPS?
So there's a couple things, right? So there's some component of it that's excess LPS, meaning more LPS than you should have. And that becomes a phase shift in the types of microbes that are living within your gut, right? So let's say normally you should have about 60% of the microbes that live in your gut are gram-negative bacteria, right? That's a normal condition, which means 60% of the microbes that live in your microbiome, which are 40 trillion or so bacteria in your microbiome, about 30 trillion of them are producing, or 25 trillion are producing LPS. Now, based on your lifestyle and what you're exposed to. So for example, if you start using lots of antacids, or you take the PPIs, the purple pills and things like that, right, just to reduce reflux, or multiple courses of antibiotics, and that disrupt your acid production and bile production and so on, what you tend to get is what we call a phase shift, where you end up with more of the microbes in your system being gram-negative bacteria, especially in the small bowel. Right. And that's actually very, very synonymous with the issue with SIBO. So now what you have is, rather than 60% of the microbes being gram negative, you might have 75% of the microbes being gram negative. And you may have more of them in the small bowel, where you're supposed to have low levels of bacteria to begin with. Right. So now you have a larger volume and more are gram negative bacteria. So you're getting more LPS being produced and released. On top of that, if your gut is leaky, then more of that is leaking through into circulation. If it stays in the intestinal tube, if it stays in the tube where the food passes through, then it's perfectly fine. It doesn't cause all of the problems we've been talking about. If it leaks through and enters into circulation, that's when it becomes a problem. So a lot of it is driven by our lifestyle and environment, right? So everything around us kills bacteria. Everything around us disrupts our microbiome in some way or the other. Even the simple things, starting with fluoride and chlorine in our drinking waters, right? If you look at our exposure to pesticides like Roundup on all the foods that we consume, if you look at the overuse of antibiotics, if you look at all of the preservatives and antimicrobials in foods themselves that we consume, the level of stress that we tend to deal with. Stress is a big driver of intestinal permeability and dysbiosis. All the consumption of processed foods and alcohol and all kinds of things that we tend to enjoy, all of those things drive dysbiosis. Oh, and a big part, a complete abandonment of our relationship with nature, right? So we are designed as a species to be in constant osmosis with the outside environment, right? We lived among and in the land.
In the dirt.
In the dirt, essentially, right? I mean, our babies were born and placed in the dirt. And what is the tendency of every baby still born today is they put everything in their mouth, right? Why do they do that? They're sampling their whole environment with their mouth. They're putting rocks and dung and dirt and all that in their mouth, because as it turns out, it's really important for babies to get that early exposure to all of these environmental bacteria, because that helps build their immune system, both from a functional standpoint and a physical standpoint. Right, it actually helps construct the physiology of their immune system, and our loss of exposure to these organisms in the outside environment, our loss of a relationship with them, means that over time we keep losing number of inhabitants within our system. This is something I've been talking about for the last year or so, where there's a mass extinction of microbes that we are supposed to be harboring and passing on to the next generation, right? And it's actually, to me, one of the scariest ecological disruption, because it impacts us directly more so than any other ecological disruption on Earth, right? And so I'll give you an example of that, right? So if you look at the current hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist, like the tribes in Papua New Guinea or in the rainforest in South America, or even the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, there's lots of microbiologists that have been studying these tribes now for the last 10 years. What you find is they tend to have double the diversity of organisms in their microbiome than we do, right? So in that period of time, we've lost half the inhabitants of our microbiome, and they're finding critically important microbes in these microbiomes that we no longer have. Microbes that have a lot of function on gut-brain access, have a lot of function on cognitive capabilities, on mood and anxiety disruption, on turning off the HPA axis after a stress response. Like all of these critical things, inflammation, of course, immune response, all of these things that are really important when you're out there in the wilderness. We've lost a lot of those organisms. And why this is so important is because the vast majority of our functionality as a human is held within our microbiome, right? Our microbiome accounts for over 90% of our genetic capability, right?
More so than our own genome.
More so than our own genome, right? So just to give you numbers to compare, our own genes have about 22,000 functional genes, right? And it sounds like a lot, but then you look at an earthworm that has about 30,000 functional genes, and you go, okay, we're not that cool, right? So an earthworm has more capabilities than we do, right? But
there is a difference in the complexity of the proteins that come out of those genomes too, right?
There is a certain degree, yes. However, the biggest part of our metabolic function and capability comes from the 2.5 million genes we have in our microbiome that's housed within the microbes, the 40 plus trillion microbes that live in our microbiome, right? So we count on that gene pool for the large part of our metabolic functionality from day to day. So as we lose those microbes, we are losing functionality as a human. It's no different than saying, hey, the next generation of kids are going to be born without a spleen, right? And the ones after that are going to be born without a spleen and with only half their liver, right? We're losing organ-like systems because we're losing massive amounts of organisms that house genetic capability for us. And as we lose those genetic capabilities, we're going to be less and less adapted to exist in the environment that we're in, right?
So the microbiome should be literally considered an organ.
It's absolutely an organ. It's the largest, most complex organ in our body. It's the second brain, as most people say, right? It has more complexity, as much complexity as our brain does. And at the end of the day, we already know that we are not well suited to exist in our environment, right? Just look at the rates of allergies and asthma and all of these other dysfunctions where people are so sensitive to the environment that they live in. And their immune systems are going haywire, you know, and a simple virus like this pandemic virus can come across and wipe out millions of people, you know, within a short period of time because we're all pretty unhealthy and we're not functioning properly.
And so this would contribute a lot to like this. It seems like there's this excess hystericalness around people in general, and people like to blame social media. But I often I wonder from hearing all of this, how much of that has to do with a lot of this gut biome being all this dysbiosis contributing to that. Like people can't keep their anxieties in check and they get excessively anxious, and then it spreads a hysteria across so many people.
It does. So that, you know, my lectures on the gut-brain axis really help illustrate for people how this process works, right? So I'll give you guys a summary of that. So basically, when you take an external stressor, let's say it's something you read online or driving to work and somebody cuts you off, whatever it may be, maybe a small external stressor, maybe something even more deep like your spouse or loved one or somebody that's really driving you crazy. That external stressor, right? The first thing that it does is it triggers the release of something called glucocorticotropin releasing hormone out of your hypothalamus, right? And then that activates your pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases a hormone to activate your adrenals, which release cortisol. Right. So that's the whole HPA axis people get to hear about, where the HPA axis gets activated from external stressors, right? So that's one way your body adapts to it. And I'll explain why all of that happens as well. So keep in mind, step one of HPA activation from an external stressor is the release of cortisol, right? So we'll pause there for a second. The step two, the other thing that happens, and I call it step two, but is actually happening in parallel to step one, is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Right, the HPA axis also activates a sympathetic nervous system, and the job of the sympathetic nervous system is to get you physically ready to fight or flight, right? Because that is your whole stress response. It's all about fight or flight. It's survival. And so the sympathetic nervous system amps up your muscles. It amps up your heart rate, your breathing rate, your perspiration rate. It also triggers your immune system to increase inflammation. Right. So it activates it releases all these catecholamines. Your sympathetic neurons will release catecholamines that activate your macrophages and your microglial cells. Your microglial cells are macrophages in the brain, basically. So now you've got systemic and brain-specific inflammation from this stress response. Now, why would your why would a stress response include an inflammatory increase from your immune system? In my view, and I think this is supported in some research, is part of that is increasing perfusion, right? Because one of the results of inflammation is better blood flow to the area, right? So if you get a cut on your hand, it becomes really red there because you've got more blood flow going there to try to repair the damage. So part of it is trying to get blood to your brain and your heart and all of that. So you're inflamed at this point, right? So now you've got cortisol levels going up from step one. And then the step two, which is actually a parallel step, is your sympathetic nervous system is up, which means inflammation, perfusion, heart rate, all of that is up. Now, when all of that is up, then immune response is lowered, and digestion and relaxation and rest and all that is lowered as well, because the sympathetic nervous system works against the parasympathetic, right? Which is the rest and digest part of the nervous system. So here you are, you're amped up, you're ready to go physically, right? Your cortisol levels are going up, your stress response is high, and you're acutely aware of a danger that's around you. Now, let's say this was olden times and we actually had physical danger. We do have, unfortunately, we do have physical danger these days too. But let's say this is normal times. You're walking to the prairie and there's a predator that jumps out. All of this activation is going to help you realize that predator is there, be acutely visual and auditory to pick up signals and clues to understand how far that predator is from you, how fast you have to run in what direction to save yourself. And then your sympathetic activation helps you run to get away from that danger, right? Now, let's say you run, you get away, you climb a tree. The important part is all of that activation has to come back down, right? Your system has to go back to normal. How does that happen? Well, part of the reason why cortisol increases is as cortisol levels increase, there's a fine point where cortisol is high enough where it starts binding receptors called glucocorticoid receptors that are found all over your body, in your brain and the rest of your system, right? As the glucocorticoid receptors start getting bound by cortisol levels, by cortisol that's in your system, they send a negative feedback back to your HPA axis to say, tone it down, right? We're no longer in danger. We have to calm things down. It also sends negative feedback to your sympathetic nervous system to tone that down and start bringing back up your parasympathetic system. So that's called a negative feedback loop, right? So cortisol plays that really important role. And it's part of the reason why it scales during stress, because it gives you stress response. It gets to a certain point where it goes, okay, now cortisol is working against the stress response to bring it back down, right? That's how you recover from that bout of stress. Here's what happens in the modern world, and especially if your gut is dysbiotic, right? You get the cortisol release, you get the sympathetic nervous system activation. Okay, you're in this ready state, you're in this stress heightened state, full of inflammation everywhere, right? Now, when your gut is dysbiotic, what tends to happen is there's a checkpoint for cortisol in the gut. It actually ends up going into the gut where it can get metabolized and read by microbes to make adjustments on metabolism in the system, right? But if your gut is dysbiotic, what cortisol will do in the gut is actually cause intestinal permeability. So now
it makes it worse.
So that's the leaky gut.
Exactly. So what tends to happen is now the elevating and elevated cortisol levels are actually increasing intestinal permeability. And as you know, intestinal permeability increases inflammation, right? So now cortisol is not only not being bound by the glucocorticoid receptors, it's actually increasing inflammation. One of the key inflammatory markers that it increases is something called IL-6. Interleukin 6, right? So interleukin 6, the damn thing goes and it activates the HPA axis. So now
it's a positive feedback loop.
It is. It ends up causing a positive feedback loop. So now the leakiness in the gut is causing more activation of HPA. Cortisol keeps going up, leaky gut keeps going up, more activation of the HPA, and they keep going up and up and up. And then IL-6 also over time reduces the expression of glucocorticoid receptors. So now you don't have those receptors to bind to get the negative feedback to bring down the system. Now you are in this constant elevated HPA axis activation. So what tends to happen is you might have been tolerant at some point, right? But now it's easier to get stressed. Every little thing stresses you out, and it's much harder to come down from it, right? And so you start
chronic anxiety.
And you have this chronic anxiety, chronic stress state. Now, what happens there is you start seeing in that elevated level of inflammation and chronic cortisol activation, you start to see a reduction in serotonin function in the brain as well, right? Not to mention that leakiness in the gut that cortisol is causing is actually increasing LPS levels. And now LPS is getting in the brain and stopping up the serotonin binding. Now you're moving from chronic anxiousness, inability to deal with stress, to depression.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why you get that pathology. So and then if LPS levels stay high, not only do you end up with depression, but you have major depressive disorders with what are called sickness behaviors. Sickness behaviors come on board because of elevated levels of LPS in this whole cycle. And those sickness behaviors are things like anhedonia. Anhedonia is the inability to feel joy from anything, right? So nothing now, things that used to make you happy no longer do, right? So now you're trying to find things that make you happy. You might start utilizing drugs or too much sex or, all the things that we try to get
addictive behaviors.
Exactly, to try to release some dopamine so we feel normal, right? You also have anorexia as part of it, severe lethargy, psychomotor slowness. So now you're just kind of slow and lethargic. Your brain doesn't really work very well. All of these other things, all of it keeps coming from this HPA axis reactivation. Now, here's an awesome thing about this, right? All of this can be arrested like that in the gut, right? It can all be fixed in the gut.
Talk about that. Let's go there, because my mind wanted to go to ask you the question of like, how does that LPS affect the motor development in children? But at the end of the day, what I really want to know is, what do we do about it?
What do you do about it? Yeah. So just keep in mind this, this kind of continuous HPA activation and then leakiness in the gut and that chronic inflammation associated with it, that's what most Americans are going through right now, right? And there's a reason why gut issues are very directly associated with mood and brain issues. For example, people with IBS, 57% of people with IBS have some degree of anxiety and depression, right? Compared to the general population where it's 22%. So if you have a gut dysfunction like IBS, you're twice as likely to have anxiety and depression, right? So it all goes hand in hand.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, right? It's double the risk factor. So here's a beautiful part of all of this is the question becomes, how is it that you can arrest this cycling and actually make the cortisol and the negative feedback loop all actually work the way it's supposed to? Because number one, we're never getting away from stress, right?
Right.
We know that. That's not a logical thing. We're always going to experience stress. The question is, how do we deal with it? And so the brain and the gut actually have a very close partnership in dealing with this factor, because this has been a thing since the first time humans were walking around this earth. Right. The ability to deal with stress is a survival mechanism, whether it's stress from predators and other tribes trying to kill you, or it's just general anxiety of being in an uncertain world. Right. The people that really accelerated in stress management survived and passed on their genes to other people. And as it turns out, passed on to microbes. So there's this one really interesting compound in the gut. It's called peptidoglycan. Right, we've been talking about an egregious compound that microbes produce, the LPS. Here's a really beneficial, important compound that microbes produce. It's called peptidoglycan, right? So PGN, we typically abbreviate it. The peptidoglycan is so interesting that when you look at the placenta of a pregnant woman, the placenta has peptidoglycan receptors and transporters. And in the baby's brain, in utero, the baby's brain has peptidoglycan receptors and transporters. And mom's bacteria, certain types of good bacteria in mom's gut that produce this peptidoglycan will produce it and release it, and it has active transport across the gut lining, and it dumps into mom's blood, and that peptidoglycan actually makes its way to the placenta, gets recognized by the receptors, gets then carried by the transporters directly to the baby's brain, right? So it's a bacterial component, an outside bacterial component that the baby's brain needs. It's so important that the baby's brain has receptors for it, right? So what does it do? It's so crazy when you think about it.
Right.
It is responsible for proliferating the development of the baby's brain. It's responsible for creating the synaptic regions, all the neuronal connections in the baby's brain. It's responsible for myelination. That's the producing, that's the insulation of the nerves, right? And it's responsible for formation of the blood-brain barrier, right? Probably some of the most critical things that could be happening for the baby in utero. For our human babies, we want their brains and their central nervous systems to develop properly, right? And if they don't, it's in part because mom did not have enough peptidoglycan producing bacteria.
Okay.
Right? So there's a bacterial component that we have adapted to use as a trigger for the development of our baby's brains. Now, why do I say that? Because studies also show if you don't get adequate exposure to peptidoglycan, then you do see neurological development issues in children that are born, and they tend to be born with central nervous disorders and so on. But the important part of here is that peptidoglycan is also important for the rest of your life. It's not just when you're in utero. The peptidoglycan is the linchpin that decides what cortisol does in your system, in your gut, right? If you have adequate levels of peptidoglycan producing bacteria, cortisol doesn't drive leakiness in the gut. Instead, cortisol is allowed to accumulate, and then more glucocorticoid receptors are expressed. Cortisol binds those, and you get the appropriate negative feedback. And in fact, inflammation in the brain, all of it comes down. So you can have a stress response, which is fine, but you will recover from it, right? You will not
It gives you a better tolerance to the cortisol.
Yeah, it gives you an absolute tolerance to the cortisol, which is what you're supposed to have, right? Cortisol itself is not bad. It's a very important survival tool. That's how we got by, right?
Right.
But the question is your system primed to deal with cortisol? And as it turns out, the one really key important thing is having microbes that produce peptidoglycan. Peptidoglycan is the key to reducing the brain inflammation and the damage that occurs from cortisol, from the leakiness of the gut that it creates to begin with, and all the inflammation that it triggers in the brain, right?
So how do we get more of it?
So that's a good question. So we work with this group called the APC. They're probably the most preeminent gut-brain researchers in the world out of Cork, Ireland, and they'd been screening and looking for individuals who had amazing stress management and low levels of anxiety and all that, compared to age-matched people that had low stress management, very high anxiety, and so on, looking at the microbiomes to look at differences. What they found was that the individuals that had low levels of stress, really good stress management and all that, tended to have this microbe called Bifidobacterium longum, which was now designated as strain 1714, which is a strain that had high levels of peptidoglycan all over it, right? And so they were like, okay, this seems like an interesting correlation that these individuals that seem to be having all their shit together and perfectly stable have a lot of this bacteria, and these individuals that are really struggling have none of this bacteria, right? So that's a correlation right there. So then they isolated the microbe, they grew it up, and then started testing it on animals first to see, can this microbe bring down inflammation in the body? Can it bring down the type of inflammation that's induced by stress, the type of inflammation that's induced by HPA axis activation, and also importantly, the type of inflammation that's induced by LPS, right? And sure enough, in all of those cases, the presence of this strain with its peptidoglycan was able to bring down all of that inflammation quite dramatically. Then they went on
the Zen biome.
That's the Zen biome, that we launched. So this was about 8 years in development, right? And then they tested it in humans. So they did a number of stress tests in humans, where they would put them to stressful scenarios. There was a couple of really cool social stress experiments, but you can do like heat stress and things like that. And you can measure cortisol release, inflammatory cytokine release, and so on. What they found was, in general, when you're taking this peptidoglycan rich bacteria, that your ability to deal with stress dramatically increases, right? And your perception of stress dramatically reduces. And in fact, with that, cortisol levels dramatically reduce. And all of the inflammatory markers that are associated with elevated stress and continuous activation of the HPA axis, all of them come down as well. And what is so exciting about it is then we were also able to see this on brain scans, because stress and mood and all that can be measured on brain scans by looking at things like delta wave bands, alpha wave, theta wave band. What they showed is that when individuals were on the probiotic, they tended to have a theta wave activity, which is that flow state that people want to be in, right? That's a
we like those.
Yeah, which is what, like, you know, creatives and artists and all talk about when they're most creative and they're coming up with all the ideas, when you're cognitively really tuned in and functioning, or the state that meditation is supposed to bring you into, right? The theta band flow state. This strain in the gut will activate neurotransmitters on the gut lining that actually go up to your brain and change brainwave function. And it puts you into that meditative theta wave function. And not only that, it actually increases activity in the stress management cortexes of the brain, which are associated with reduction in negative emotions from stresses, right? So now you might be stressed, but number one, the perception of the stress is dramatically reduced. Your ability to recover from the physiology of the stress is dramatically improved. And your formation of negative emotions because of that stress is dramatically improved as well. So all of that is so important in our ability to figure out and navigate through this life that we're in, right? And then ultimately, we also showed significant improvement in brain fatigue, right? We all feel that. You go through stressful weeks and all that, and you're physically tired, but you're more so just mentally drained, right?
Yeah.
It's a real phenomenon called mental fatigue. And then there's a measure that's an accepted claim actually in Europe called vitality. So all these brainwave measures of vitality were dramatically increased as well. So all of that from just this one peptidoglycan thing in the gut, right? And this complex machinery of stress management and cortisol and feedback loops and all of this crazy stuff that's going on. Here's this one microbe that goes in that just puts a thumb on it and stops this whole nonsense, right?
I love it.
It's just mind-boggling to me.
I love that you came up with that. So how do we help our people get rid of their leaky gut?
Yeah. So for the leaky gut, the spore-based probiotics are the most critically important, right? So we published our first study on that in 2017, and we've continued to do studies on that since then. And the Megaspore, the spore-based probiotics, those are the key. That's the key one to stopping that leaky gut and stopping that LPS from migrating through. What we showed in that first study that was published in a gastroenterology journal was that in a 30-day period of just taking the spores once a day, no other changes to anything else, right? No changes to diet, lifestyle, anything. We were able to reduce the amount of LPS that's leaking into circulation by 60%, right? So a huge reduction. Huge amount, right? That's very hard to achieve just from lifestyle changes at all. Then you add that on top of eating, improving your diet, getting some exercise in, mindfulness work and all that, you'll dramatically reduce the amount of LPS or leakiness in the gut. So once you take care of the LPS component, then the other part you need to get in is the peptidoglycan component, right? And that's where the ZenBiome comes in. So now we've had lots of people now in the last month and a half since we've launched ZenBiome that are doing the Megaspore, and ZenBiome is kind of a total gut brain solution, and we're getting some really dramatic feedback from people.
I've got all my kids on both of those.
Awesome.
I am super stoked about that. Except I hadn't been giving my little guy, who does have he has gross motor delays. And that's why I was asking about that. It was caused by epilepsy, but the epilepsy was controlled. And so now I'm starting to wonder if just adding in that probiotic along with the spore-based one might help accelerate some of that, because he also has GERD.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So
So
you should definitely get him the 1714 strain.
Okay.
You also want to consider getting him the K2. So vitamin K2 is,
Oh,
a lot of the effect is
okay.
obviously the neurodegeneration of the epilepsy, right? So
Mm-hmm.
epilepsy will cause nerve die-off and cause damage to the nerves. And so what you
Mm-hmm.
want is the regeneration of the neurons and then the mitochondria within the neurons. And so K2 has been shown to be able to improve that quite dramatically. So how old is he?
Okay. He's 3.
He's 3. Okay. So he can do 90 micrograms of K2,
Cool.
and he'll be perfectly fine. And it'll really support the neurological development.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. I feel like I've done my job today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow. This makes me really excited. Chris, what other questions do you have? Oh, we've got Kiran here for a few more minutes.
Yeah. So, the big thing that looking back at some of my, just listening to you describe a lot of this and looking at the last couple of years of my own life of trying to work from being almost 400 pounds and losing over 100 pounds, I'm down about 120. And what I went through and some of the struggles that I felt along the way, a lot of that makes a ton of sense because it was this constant, the ability to deal with stress that you were talking about. That felt so hard, and it hits your self-esteem in a really tough way when it's like, I should be able to deal with this. This should not be a problem. This is not that hard. And yet at the same time, it feels like you just want to curl up in a ball some days. And it's like, what's going on? This does not make sense. But my diet before a lot of this was candy bars and bags of chips, and none of it was really, obviously very poor for gut microbiome. And so even trying to shift it, like you said, just trying to shift it with diet, it's like the good bacteria weren't there, even though I was feeding, eating salads, eating proteins, healthy, lean proteins. It still was such a challenge, and to kind of overcome that. So that's very enlightening. And I can see how it would, like you were saying, to take that now and get that PGN up very quickly and make that shift is going to make it a lot easier for our clients to make those lifestyle changes where they're not going to struggle so hard.
It will. And a couple of points on that. So at what stage in your life did you start gaining weight, excessive weight that was hard to control?
Probably late teens.
Late teens? Okay.
17, 18 is where it really started to get bad. And then from there for the next good 15 years, it was unhealthy. Yeah.
And were your parents overweight?
On my father's side, yeah, my father was, plus all of the my aunts and uncles on that side of the family. There's a lot of diabetes.
Yeah. Okay. So, and here's what I would say about that. The research indicates that what drove your obesity to begin with back then, right? Back when you're in your late teens, is leaky gut, right? So it's not that your gut was leaky because you gained weight, but you started to gain weight because your gut was leaky. So you started having lots of endotoxemia, LPS endotoxemia, even at that early stage, right? And that, of course, starts to swell, as I mentioned, your fat cells. It starts to disrupt your metabolism. It actually cuts off the gut-brain connection where your gut is telling your brain that, hey, there's enough food in here, stop releasing the hunger hormone, and you don't get the release of the satiety hormone, right? So we saw that in our first leaky gut study, where the individuals that had leaky gut, really severe leaky gut, and lots of LPS in their system, even though they were not overweight individuals at the time, what we saw is that their ghrelin response, their hunger hormone response, was really poor, right? So they would come into the lab fasted, so their hunger hormone levels would be really high. We'd give them a 2,000 calorie meal, and their hunger hormone levels would barely drop and then start going back up again, right? So there's no satiety response. Right now, when we gave them the probiotic for 30 days, what we saw then is that they would come in with the elevated hunger hormone because they're fasted, and then when we give them the 2,000 calorie meal, the hunger hormones would drop 50% within the first 2.5, 3 hours.
Wow!
Right. So now the gut is starting to talk to the brain again, going, "Hey, there's plenty of food. Stop producing the hunger hormone. In fact, produce the satiety hormone, leptin." Right. And that leptin is not only going to make you more satiated, so it's easier to stop eating when you're actually full and satiated, the other aspect of that is that's what kicks off the metabolic process, right? Because not only is it telling you that you're full, you don't need any more calories coming in, it's also kicking on, it's kicking on something called an AMPK, which is a signal for the rest of your body to burn fat for fuel, right? As you're metabolizing and digesting food. And it's also providing the glucose control. And if you lose glucose control, it's because of that continuous leakiness in the gut, right? And then here's a double whammy of leaky gut and LPS endotoxemia. So not only is it causing you to gain weight, right? It's also driving poor glucose control. It's driving poor gut-brain communication, and it's also interfering with dopamine binding, right? So now in order for you to get satiated, like we all do from food, right? Food is a very important part of that reward system in our biology, right? Because food was not always accessible. We had to go out there and work for it. And so our evolutionary biology dictates that we should feel rewarded for going out and making the effort to get food. And so we all get a dopamine response when we eat food. But if your dopamine response is curbed because of LPS, and you're gaining weight and you're not getting the satiety signals, then you tend to eat more to try to stoke that dopamine response, right? So it becomes a little bit more like an addictive behavior. And you try to
it starts to drive
dramatic things. Yeah, exactly. And you need more dramatic things, right? Like you go from just eating certain sweet things to more sweet things and a lot larger amounts of that to try to drive that dopamine response. And so it all just perpetuates that way.
Whereas in like a normal food diet with somebody who has good responses, something like a piece of fruit would normally satisfy that dopamine response. But without that, then you're turning to your M&Ms and Snickers bars that are super high sugar response and very sweet.
Yeah, very sweet.
Right, because I would eat an apple and be like, this doesn't even taste good.
Totally, yeah.
And it's just like, this is not hitting that response because you are expecting it and it's not happening.
That's exactly right. I see it like, for example, with my kids, prior to them screwing up their metabolic processes, you see when an ideal metabolic process works the way it should, it's really fascinating to me, because even their most favorite food in the world, you could give them pizza and ice cream, right? And the moment they've had enough, they do not want it at all, right? They can push it away, right? They're good. My daughter will eat one slice of pizza, and even though she ordered her old personal pizza, she'll have wanting nothing to do with it, right? And then, or my son who loves ice cream, if he has an ice cream, if he eats through enough of it where he's satiated, then he wants nothing to do with it. He's done with it completely, right? And we don't have that kind of control anymore as adults, right? If we ordered a pizza or a burger or ice cream, whatever it is that we ordered to reward ourselves, right? We're going to finish that thing whether we're stuffed or not stuffed, right? It's very hard to push it away. So it's amazing to see how well the system works when it works, and then how easily it all goes off track when it doesn't. And then we're self-medicating with food as we're trying to give ourselves that dopamine response over and over again. So I think what you'll find that if you seal up the gut lining with the spores or the probiotics, you start increasing your intake of prebiotic, especially the mega prebiotic. It'll increase butyrate production and short chain fatty acids, which are going to be critical to controlling metabolic process. Butyrate, for example, is the biggest driver of glucose control, right? In fact, that's how the drug metformin for diabetes works. It increases butyrate production in the gut, right?
So interesting.
Without any of the nasty side effects.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of people talk about that one too. In the whole like longevity circles, they talk about they're taking metformin and they're not diabetics. They're just taking it as a supplement.
As a butyrate thing. Yep.
They take it so they can be shredded.
Right.
After eating pancakes. And I'm going, there's a problem here.
That doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
I love this. You touched on everything I could possibly ever want to ask you in 1 hour. You are amazing. Thank you so much for this.
Of course. It's my pleasure.
This will be one that I'm going to come back and watch, because there's a lot of info here to process.
I'm sending this to everybody. not only our clients, but oh, by the way, Kiran, what you didn't know, because we just jumped right in with you, is Chris is my CTO. So we've rebuilt the app. Back when we met, we were talking about what I was doing with technology and personal training. And I'm going to send you a link so that you can check it out. I think you're going to be pretty excited about it.
I would love to see it.
We've included a lot of your products in our practice to be able to help people get the results that they want.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you guys so much for having me, because, you know, all of this information sitting in my head and all the research we do is meaningless unless you get it out to people, right? And
absolutely. Well, so I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate the time that you gave us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, I just spent a couple weeks in Europe. A number of those days was spent with our research team out in Denmark now. And, you know, there's a lot of exciting stuff coming out in the pipeline. But at the end of the day, you know, to us, we can take care of LPS, which we do through the spores, the total gut restoration system, and so on. And then now if we can add in the peptidoglycan component to it with the Zen Biome, just between those two alone, we're solving a lot of problems. You know, so it's super amazing. Exciting. And then all the other things that you guys shepherd people through with healthy lifestyle, exercise, and all that, you know, all of that will be compounded significantly when we get these root cause issues under control.
Absolutely. Well, it won't be so difficult, and it won't take so long, and exactly. They'll get results faster.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially once the testimonials start coming in for it, that's going to make it a lot easier for people to see what they're going to get from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. The prebiotic will be critical. If people can handle that dramatically enhances the effect of the spores, almost triples the effect of the spores.
I had no idea. I got the Biome FX done and everything looks good. I just didn't have enough. And the doctor just said, just take some prebiotic. I went, okay.
Oh,
The one thing I was missing. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kiran. I'm going to go take my son to physical therapy now and let you get on with the rest of your day. And I really appreciate everything that you had to contribute today.
It's my
pleasure. Very much.
Great to see you, Allie.
Great to see you too.
Great to meet you.
If you make it out to Orange County,
to meet you, Kiran.
let's grab another drink sometime.
Let's do it. Let's do it. We're overdue for another dinner.
We are. Right? Let's do that.
All
right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.